Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Here's a very, very warm welcome to everybody to the show. As always, I'm very grateful for people tuning in and having a listen, and it's a great pleasure to announce that we're global, and I'm really thrilled with that. So, again, this week I'm flying solo. I'm just wondering how your week's been going. What have you been challenged by? What's your crisis in your life, and how have you dealt with it? Is there an ongoing crisis, or was it just a small one that actually made you think? Because one of the things that I'm big on is actually helping people to think, to rethink, and to reflect on what's going on in their life and in their world. Some of us have challenges that, maybe life and death, others not so much. So again, welcome back. Today's topic that I want to talk about is actually a sort of a part two from the last podcast, which was in essence about opening men to therapy. This week what I want to do is I want to talk about opening therapy up to men. But before I do that, I just want to reach out and say a great thank you to Mark Vandergaard, who extended and reached out to me some time ago to get interviewed for a program that he's running. Now, Mark's a coach, and he's got, decades of experience in that field. He is a very impressive man, and, he's one of those guys that I put into that category of, here is a good man turned great. His warmth and his character and, what he's done with his life is just outstanding. And so I want to, again, thank Mark for the opportunity to be on the program with him. We had a fantastic, meaningful conversation, and I'm really hoping to be able to have more of them with him. Now, I'll give you a little background on Mark. He's the founder of Core Power Coaching, and he has a signature program called the Radical Reboot Camp and Cluster. He helps people get clear about their vision and unblock whatever stops them from really achieving that vision, and put it into action. And I think that's a really cool thing, especially at a time like this, where sometimes we can feel a bit disheartened and discouraged about, who we are, what we're doing, where we're going, and what's it all about. The world has a tendency to throw some curveballs at us, and as we really, really have experienced in the last, 12 months, essentially, that our world is unpredictable in some ways. But the question is not about what's happening out in the world, but how, as a man, as a woman, as a nation, as a community, are we going to respond to those sort of challenges? Because they're never going to go away. They're always going to be there. We can go right back into the early days of the hunter-gatherers, where life was even more unpredictable and challenging. So let me get you to really think about that. So one of the things that's important, I think, is like myself and people like Mark Vandergaard, who are engaged in trying to help and in helping people achieve what they can, both individually but also socially and spiritually. I think it's a really important thing to understand one of the cornerstones in the world of change and change management. And I'm going to talk about therapy essentially, because in many respects that's the point of origin to help people. And, men have been reluctant to engage with that. And as I spoke about in the last podcast, there's some very, very valid reason why men fundamentally have been reluctant to engage with that process. I'm not going to go over them. If you want to, check in, go to the last podcast, have a listen to what I talked about. But what I want to talk about today is the flip side of the coin, and that is, the idea that therapy isn't really accessible the way it has been practiced traditionally to men. And my argument is not in its entirety. Yes, men who are in touch with their emotions already and who, appreciate the process of challenging themselves and being introspective and reflective are not going to have too much of a problem with it. But what about the guy who's out there who hasn't got the experience, the education, the socialization in this? Because remember, one of the problems with patriarchy is that it puts us into a place of functioning essentially unconsciously, and then when it does become more conscious, we write it off as that is our nature. That's just how I am. Boys will be boys. And I really want to challenge that idea, because if we don't get through that, we're going to get stuck. We're not going to have any of the changes that we should have within ourselves, within our relationships, and within our communities. So the idea is that I want you to think about how patriarchy, from what we've been talking about, has influenced how you think about men and masculinity. And I'm talking to women as much as I'm talking to men at this point. Because let me put it forward to you that traditionally this ideology has led us to construct sets of meanings that we call gender in a very binary and divisive duality. It's kept us apart to a large degree. Let's take a look at cultures where men and women have very, very separate cultures. And, we might sort of look at the Middle East, but, whenever I go to a barbecue here in Australia, one of the things that I see often is the men are clustered in one corner of the garden and the women are clustered around the kitchen and the table. And, the men might prepare the meat, but the women prepare everything else, which is, interestingly enough, a bit of a sort of legacy from hunter-gathering. That was seriously the case. So we need to challenge ourselves by looking at deconstructing patriarchy. And I'm talking to psychologists, psychotherapists, counsellors, coaches, to really reflect on what it is that you believe about gender, sexuality, masculinity, femininity, because that's the ground zero that we're often operating in. So we've got emerging scientific, anthropological and sociological research that suggests that we've been actually blinded to the coloured spectrum of what it means to be a man. We see it as one thing rather than as a rainbow. So, for instance, we've always associated high testosterone, the male hormone, with high libido, great aggressiveness, and higher risk-taking. But is that naturally the case? I work with a lot of men who've come to me in a sort of, melancholic, depressed state, but they're really aggro. They're the sort of grumpy old man, but they might be 35 years old. And in my clinical experience, one of the things that often emerges out of that is that they don't actually have high levels of testosterone. What they're suffering from is low levels of testosterone. So even at that level, we really need to think about what traditional patriarchal ideology has been sprouting, and that most of the time we've accepted as fact, when in reality it's not, it's a construct. Now I'm going to come back to the issue that in most instances men don't think about patriarchy. They don't think about, how it is they got to be that particular way, that traditional, masculine, stoic, strong, unexpressive, emotional, state. We just don't have those conversations, generally speaking, although it is getting better. So I want to encourage men to actually buy into this and go, okay, what does it mean? Don't necessarily accept what I'm saying, but take it from the point of view of a meaningful conversation with each other. We don't do that a lot. I've got lots of teenage boys that are starting to do that in therapy and in counselling, and they're taking it out into their peer groups. Some of them, unfortunately, have some bad experiences with that because, they might just get a bit of stick, get a bit of ridicule. But the ones who have a strong belief in the need to change will stand by what they're learning. The problem is we also, in the same vein, don't have a very clear idea about what femininity is about. And that often comes through denigrating, criticising and rejecting even feminism. Now, feminism's been good in that it's given us a very good socio-political definition of patriarchy, but it's never really been put into an accessible framework for the average man to be able to relate to it. And that was one of my missions, in essence, is to be able to do that. So the patriarchal model, the way that I describe it, is really a framework in action. It explains what the values are that drive us to do what it is that we do individually and culturally. Okay? So remember the four cornerstones: being territorial, being hierarchical, being acquisitional, and being competitive. Now, you might want to ask yourself, well, how does that work around therapy? What's therapy really about? And again, one of the things that I talk about is that fundamentally for me as a psychotherapist is to help someone to understand themselves within the context of the world that they're in and how to adapt to it in a way that they can thrive and not just survive. So the elements that I'm working with as a therapist with men, and this is an interesting aspect, is that I want to get them to open up emotionally, but in order to get there, I actually need to often come through the cognitive door, the thinking space that men are in. So, one of the things that I've often said, if you want to stop women in therapy, ask them what they want. If you want to stop men in therapy, ask them what they're feeling. And usually we draw somewhat of a blank. We have to think about it. Right? So that disconnect between emotion and thought can be very, very powerful in the way that we've socialised men and the consequences of that. So one of the consequences of patriarchal socialisation is my narrowed emotional range in a way. And I want to break out of that. So I want to break out of that. I also want to help people become more empathic because in understanding themselves, they might get some insight into the other person that they're with and therefore generate a greater sense of intimacy, which in the long run is going to be so much more satisfying, and it might just save your marriage or your partnership. So this aspect of self-awareness and making the unconscious conscious is a very important aspect. Now, the problem is a lot of guys are shy of that because, how they're going to feel about negative feelings, how they're going to feel about what they're thinking, and how are they going to think about what they're feeling. It gets all a little confusing at times, and at times quite overwhelming. So part of opening up therapy, for men is to help them with frameworks. We're good because we're trained to go, okay, here is the problem, and this is the solution that I need to apply to deal with the problem. The only issue with that is that quite often we're missing the bits between. And this is where frameworks really help. Understanding that, my emotions can be, by and large sensations that I've labelled, and I can relabel those. And that, my thinking affects how I feel, and therefore that affects my decisions. And understanding that, but also the other part of self-awareness, and this is my experience of myself physically, and the connection between my physical being, integrating it with my emotional, psychological, cognitive being, as well as my spiritual being. And so it's very, very important in my view that therapy has the capacity to help men, particular to establish a framework from which they understand themselves better and from which they can actually deal with their fears and anxieties in a much more effective way, so that we're going to be looking at enhancing the emotional vocabulary, enhancing empathy, being able to really understand that, that tension in my chest isn't that I'm having a heart attack, although if you haven't had a medical checkup, please, go and see a doctor before you go to see the therapist or the coach. Very, very important. But it's also about making us more emotionally, behaviourally and cognitively flexible, right? So that we don't fall into being so rigid that we can't adapt to our own changes. I mean, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of men, as much as it is for women, is that experience of ageing. Moving into the third age for a lot of us is seriously challenging. We don't have the stamina, the strength. Now, yes, we can do lots and lots of things to, push that out. But ultimately, we're going to have to simply accept the fact that I'm getting older and that I need to work smarter at it and not harder. We also need to become more resilient to the social pressures around that. And yes, there's some facts. I mean, one of the facts for men 55 plus is that at some point you may be let go from your corporate job. And then what? What do you then? Now, the other really important issue that is often missed when I work with men who've been in therapy before is that there's been a void around dealing with a sense of shame. And shame, it's a very important concept, and I can't stress that enough, is that we need to help, especially men, rise to the challenge of dealing with having been shamed. And it often starts as very small boys, and it festers, it sits there, and it just, stops us from doing many, many things, especially evolving into the, human being that we can be. Now, most importantly, one of the things that I tie in very, very early in the way that I work with men is to talk about the frameworks, to talk about, feelings, thinking, actions, and how they interrelate, that they're not, discrete and distinct things that just happen to us. I very much take the idea out of Buddhism that our attachment to negative thinking and feelings, negative feelings, brings us into a space of suffering. So the idea is, how do I, work through that? How do I move beyond suffering into a space where I'm thriving? And I'm very concrete with that. And my experience in traditional therapy is that that's more abstract and obscure and covert. But when I make it more overtly accessible to men, there's this moment where they go, oh yeah, I get it. Okay, I can see how that hangs together. Now, they might need to work really hard on it, but rather than going, I don't get this, I'm going to just get out, leave it, it's too hard. It encourages them to stay, especially when I come down to the core fundamental variable in this, and that is forming a powerful therapeutic relationship with who I'm working with. It is critical. And in that relationship, I need to be conscious as a therapist about the language and the processes that I use in communicating with my client. And one of the things that it brings me into that space is the metaphor of peeling the onion, is helping men to understand, how do we get to the core, the central space in which my authentic self really exists. So I've packed a lot into this, but I really want to encourage you to reflect on it. Reflect on your experiences if you've been in therapy, and if you're a professional in this space, please reach out. I'd love to have more meaningful conversations with other, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychologists, social workers, coaches about making this space, this therapeutic space, this coaching space, this counselling space, so much more, not necessarily appealing, but accessible. Okay, on that point, I'm going to leave you. And again, I hope this was meaningful to you. If you've got any questions, please get in touch. If you don't believe some of the stuff, ask. Let's have a conversation about it. I'm not necessarily talking to the converted. I want to hear from those who are unconvinced, especially about issues of patriarchy, and I know you're out there. Till next time, I'm signing off.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.